All right, let's get right into it. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to unpack something truly fascinating today. We are looking at the hidden socioeconomic history behind one of the absolute most famous and, let's be honest, infamous rivalries in the entire world. It's a story that plays out on a football pitch, sure, but as you'll see in a minute, it is rooted in something so much deeper than sports.
So, what if the world's fiercest rivalry isn't actually about sports at all? Now, I know if you follow football, when you hear Old Firm and think of Celtic and Rangers, your mind instantly goes to two things: 90 minutes of absolutely brutal tackles and intense religious vitriol. But what if I told you that the actual foundation of this fierce divide wasn't built in a church, and it wasn't built in a stadium either?
I love this quote. The River Clyde did not just build ships, it forged an identity. That pretty much hits the nail on the head and captures the true heart of our story. I want you to transport yourself back to 19th century Glasgow. The River Clyde was the absolute lifeblood of this city. We're not talking about a quiet, scenic waterway here. We are talking about a roaring, massive powerhouse of marine engineering. The real story of this rivalry was born right there, right on the water's edge.
Part 1. Beyond the football pitch.
To really grasp what's going on here, we have to peel back that top layer. We got to look past the surface-level religious arguments and the weekend matches. Because to understand the Old Firm, you absolutely must look beyond the pitch and into the dry docks. Back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Glasgow had a very distinct heartbeat, and it wasn't the sound of fans cheering. It was the rhythmic, metallic pulse of hammers in the shipyards. This intense industrial noise literally dictated the tribal allegiances of a city that was split by faith, by geography, and most importantly, by labor. The shipyards were the whole shebang.
Part 2. The geographic border.
Okay, so in the mid-1800s, Glasgow was proudly known as the second city of the empire. During this massive industrial boom, the River Clyde acted as a strict, unyielding physical and economic border. It drew thousands to its banks and created this incredibly volatile social chemistry. On one side, Side A, you've got the East End. This was primarily home to Irish Catholic immigrants working in textile mills and construction, which eventually led to the founding of Celtic. Then, you look at Side B, right across the river in Govan. There you have the Protestant workforce, heavily influenced by Unionist and Ulster Scots culture, anchoring the shipyards and naturally aligning with Rangers. So the river literally divided these two distinct, hardworking communities.
The timeline here is actually crucial to understand. Mid-1800s, huge waves of Irish Catholic immigrants flee the devastation of the Great Famine and settle predominantly in Glasgow's East End. That's a massive demographic shift. Fast forward a bit. 1872, Rangers Football Club is founded over in Govan. 15 years later, in 1887, Celtic is founded in the East End. Now, these weren't just a few guys getting together for a kickabout in the park. Almost overnight, these clubs became absolute fundamental pillars of their communities.
And that's the key takeaway here. You really can't view these early clubs as just sporting organizations. Celtic was actually founded with a highly specific socio-economic purpose: to raise money for the impoverished Irish Catholic diaspora living in the East End. Rangers, on the flip side, organically evolved into the de facto representative body and focal point for the Protestant labor force working the Govan shipyards. So they were vital community hubs. They were literally the glue holding these distinct, divided neighborhoods together.
Part 3. The 1912 Belfast Catalyst.
Now, for years, this local rivalry was intense, for sure, but it was still largely sporting in nature. But then, a seismic shift happens, 1912. Keep this exact year in your mind. This is the moment that transformed what was a relatively porous local border into a hardened, deeply entrenched cultural war. Everything flips right here.
So why does 1912 matter so much? Well, the Belfast-based shipbuilding giant Harland and Wolff decided to expand, and they opened a massive new yard right in Govan. This corporate expansion was a huge deal because it brought a sudden, massive influx of Ulster Protestant workers crossing the sea from Northern Ireland straight into Glasgow to build ships.
And the impact of that influx? It was staggering. These new workers brought with them the fierce, deeply rooted sectarian allegiances of Northern Ireland. And what ended up happening was this intensely political and religious identity got overlaid directly onto the local Glasgow football landscape. Rangers, being geographically right there in Govan and culturally tied to the shipyards, naturally became the home for this new demographic. Over time, club hiring and signing policies actually evolved to reflect this workforce, and that completely hardened a divide that had previously been, well, somewhat fluid. So looking back at it, the shipyards basically transformed into recruiting grounds for a cultural war, totally altering the demographics of the city and its football. Part 4. The Labor Identity Struggle.
Which brings us to this incredibly fascinating realization. This whole thing wasn't just about religion in a vacuum. It was fundamentally a struggle for labor and survival. The old firm is essentially what you could call a socio-economic fossil. Think about that for a second. What we are really watching today is an ongoing Victorian labor dispute. It's an ancient struggle for industrial dominance during periods of extreme economic scarcity, totally masked as a modern sports rivalry. You know, when jobs are scarce, tensions arise. And that tension, it desperately needed an outlet.
Because the shipyards were so central to the city's economic survival, that industrial reality, the fierce competition for shipyard and factory jobs, found its outlet in a football proxy, the struggle for dominance on the pitch. Declaring support for a club wasn't just about picking your favorite team. Your club loyalty was a literal proxy for your economic status and your place in the city's industrial hierarchy. It was how you declared exactly where you belonged on the incredibly fierce economic map of Glasgow.
Part 5. A living industrial artifact.
When we look at what this rivalry represents today, this idea is so important. The clubs did not set out to create the division, they were the vessels into which the city poured its own industrial anxieties. The brilliance, and the occasional ugliness, of the old firm lies in this totally unvarnished inheritance. The football clubs didn't sit down in a boardroom somewhere and engineer this divide. They simply absorbed the intense communal histories, the fears, and the anxieties of the workers who packed their terraces every single Saturday.
And that brings us to the physical legacy left behind in the city today. The massive shipyards of the Clyde, they've largely vanished or been transformed. The textile mills, mostly gone. But Celtic Park stands there as a permanent geographic marker of those East End mills, and Ibrox stands as a permanent geographic marker of the Govan shipyards. These two massive concrete stadia stand facing each other across the city as permanent monuments to that 1912 industrial divide. Actually, it's a divide that, in many ways, never truly healed.
So what you should really take away from all this is that the incredible passion, the absolutely deafening chants, the flags, and yes, the vitriol you see at these matches, they are all direct echoes of Victorian labor history. They're echoes of a time when the shipyards didn't just build vessels meant to cross oceans. They built fierce tribal identities meant to last for centuries. It's literally history repeating itself for 90 minutes every few months. Which leaves us with a final, kind of haunting question. The next time you see these two teams meet, the next time you see the green and white clash with the blue, ask yourself, are you just watching a football game? Or are you watching the ghosts of the shipyards? I think it completely changes how you view this rivalry forever. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this sparked your curiosity to look a little deeper into the history all around us. See you next time.